The plane takes off from New York, bound for Los Angeles. The excitement of a new journey fills the air, but for James Carter, a black soldier, this flight marks more than just a trip. He sits in his economy class seat, his mind wandering to the mission he's just completed overseas. His eyes scan the first-class cabin, noting the stark contrast between his current position and the luxury just a few feet away. In first class, Karen Thompson settles into her plush seat, her designer bag placed carefully beside her. She's a picture of success, immaculately dressed, exuding confidence, and completely at ease in her surroundings. As she notices James looking towards the first-class cabin, her lips curl into a slight sneer. She turns away, focusing on her tablet, dismissing his presence entirely. The flight attendant begins the safety announcement, his voice a practiced monotone. But the routine is interrupted when James stands up, politely asking if he could switch seats with Karen. His request is met with an icy stare from the executive. "Excuse me?" Karen's voice is sharp, cutting through the ambient noise of the plane. "I paid for this seat. I'm not giving it up for anyone, especially not you." The flight attendant, sensing the tension, tries to intervene. "Ma'am, perhaps we could dash." "No," Karen interrupts, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This is my seat. End of discussion." James, taken aback by the harshness of her response, tries to explain. "I apologize for the inconvenience, but I've just returned from a difficult mission and dash." "That's not my problem," Karen snaps, turning back to her tablet. "Your lack of planning doesn't constitute an emergency on my part." The other passengers begin to take notice of the exchange, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others watching with poorly concealed interest. The atmosphere in the plane shifts from excitement to tension, as the confrontation between James and Karen threatens to escalate. James takes a deep breath, struggling to maintain his composure. He's faced worse situations during his service, but this blatant disrespect stings. "Ma'am, I understand you paid for your seat. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm simply requesting a bit of understanding and kindness." Karen looks up from her tablet, her eyes narrowing. "Understanding? Kindness? Let me explain something to you. I've worked hard for everything I have. I don't owe you or anyone else anything." Her voice drips with sarcasm as she continues. "Or should I give up my seat just because you wear a uniform?" The tension in the air grows thicker. Other passengers begin to take notice, some whispering among themselves, others pretending to be engrossed in their books or devices. A middle-aged man a few rows back shakes his head disapprovingly at Karen's attitude. James, his patience wearing thin, decides to confront the issue head-on. "Miss Thompson, is it? Do you truly believe that your social status or the size of your bank account makes you superior to others?" His voice is calm but firm, carrying easily through the cabin. Karen bristles at the direct question. "I didn't say that. Don't put words in my mouth." She glances around, noticing the attention they're attracting. "Look, I don't have to justify myself to you or anyone else on this plane." A young woman seated nearby pipes up. "Maybe we should all calm down and dash." "Stay out of this," Karen snaps, her composure slipping. "This is between me and him." James holds up a hand, silencing the brewing argument. "No, let's hear what everyone has to say. After all, we're all stuck on this flight together." He turns to address the cabin at large. "Does anyone else think it's acceptable to treat people this way based on their appearance or profession?" The silence that follows is deafening. Passengers exchange uncomfortable glances, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Karen shifts in her seat, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face for the first time. The tense silence is broken by an unexpected action from Karen. With trembling hands, she reaches in her bag and pulls out a small notepad. She scribbles something quickly, then hands the note to James, avoiding eye contact. James, surprised by this sudden change, takes the note and reads it silently. His expression shifts from anger to confusion, then to understanding. The note reveals Karen's deeply rooted insecurities and childhood traumas, explaining how she grew up in a household steeped in racist beliefs. I didn't expect this," James says softly, looking at Karen with new eyes. Karen, her voice barely above a whisper, responds, "Neither did I." I've never told anyone about this. Sensing the shift in mood, James decides to share his own story. I joined the military to serve my country, but also to prove something to myself and others. I've faced discrimination, doubt, and fear. But I've also experienced camaraderie and respect that transcends skin color. He pauses, his voice catching as he continues. I lost my best friend in combat last year. He was white, but in the heat of battle, color didn't matter. We were brothers fighting for each other and for what we believed in. The other passengers listen intently, the earlier hostility replaced by a somber atmosphere. James goes on, what I'm fighting for isn't just about race. It's about recognition and respect for all human beings, regardless of their skin color, background, or social status. Karen, visibly moved, speaks up, I never thought about it that way. My parents always taught me that success was everything, that we had to be better than them. I never questioned who they were. A middle-aged woman across the aisle interjects gently. It's never too late to question those beliefs, dear. We all have our blind spots. James nods in agreement. Exactly. The first step is acknowledging our biases. The next is working to overcome them. As the conversation continues, the mood in the cabin shifts. What started as a confrontation is evolving into a dialogue, with passengers leaning in to listen and share their own experiences. The flight, initially marked by tension, is becoming an unexpected forum for open and honest discussion about prejudice and understanding. The conversation expands beyond James and Karen, drawing in other passengers. The atmosphere in the cabin transforms from tense to engaged, as people begin sharing their own experiences with prejudice and discrimination. A middle-aged man clears his throat and speaks up. I never thought much about these issues until my daughter started dating a black man. The looks they get, the comments, it opened my eyes to a world I'd been blind to. His words resonate with several passengers, nodding in understanding. A young woman chimes in. As a second-generation immigrant, I've faced subtle discrimination my whole life. It's not always overt, but it's there in the assumptions people make. Karen, looking increasingly uncomfortable, admits, I've never had to think about these things. I guess that's part of the problem, isn't it? James nods. That's what we call privilege. It's not about blame, it's about awareness. An elderly woman who had been quietly listening speaks up, her voice soft but clear. I came to this country as a refugee 60 years ago. The hardships we faced, people treated us like we were less than human. She pauses, her eyes misty with memories. But there were also those who showed kindness, who saw us as people first. Her words hang in the air, heavy with emotion. The cabin is silent for a moment as passengers absorb the weight of her experience. A businessman in a crisp suit adds, in my company, we've been working on diversity initiatives. It's not easy, and we make mistakes, but we're trying to create a more inclusive environment. This prompts a discussion about workplace discrimination, with several passengers sharing stories of bias they've encountered or witnessed in their professional lives. As the conversation flows, it becomes clear that nearly everyone on the plane has been touched by prejudice in some way, either as a target or as a bystander. The dialogue is not always comfortable, but it's honest and eye-opening. James, observing the exchange, remarks, this is how change begins. By talking, by listening, by acknowledging our shared humanity. Karen, who has been mostly quiet, finally speaks up. I never realized, I knew racism existed, but I didn't understand how pervasive it is, how it affects people every day. The conversation continues, with passengers from all walks of life contributing their perspectives. What started as a conflict has transformed into a powerful moment of collective reflection and learning. As the discussion continues, a young couple seated near James and Karen becomes the focus of attention. The man, visibly uncomfortable, speaks up hesitantly. I've never really thought about racism before. I know it exists, but I guess I've always believed it wasn't my problem. His partner, a woman with olive skin, turns to him with a mixture of surprise and disappointment. How can you say that? My parents are immigrants. We've faced discrimination our entire lives. The man shifts in his seat, clearly caught off guard. I didn't know. You never told me about that. Because I shouldn't have to. she responds, her voice trembling slightly. It's not just my responsibility to educate you about these issues. This exchange captures the attention of the other passengers, highlighting the importance of open communication and awareness even in close relationships. Karen, who has been listening intently, interjects, I'm starting to realize how much I've been living in a bubble. It's uncomfortable to confront these truths. James nods in agreement. Growth is often uncomfortable, but it's necessary. The conversation shifts as passengers begin to discuss ways to become more aware and actively combat prejudice in their daily lives. A teacher in her mid-40s shares, in my classroom, we've started implementing diversity and inclusion programs. It's amazing to see how open and accepting children can be when given the chance. This prompts a discussion about education and its role in shaping attitudes towards race and diversity. Parents on the flight share their experiences and concerns about raising children in a world where racism still exists. The young woman from the couple speaks again, this time addressing the entire cabin. It's not enough to just not be racist. We need to be actively anti-racist. That means speaking up when we see discrimination, even when it's uncomfortable. Her words resonate with many passengers, sparking a conversation about personal responsibility and the importance of being an ally. As the dialogue continues, it becomes clear that this flight has become more than just a journey from one city to another. It's become a journey of self-discovery and collective growth, challenging preconceptions and fostering a new understanding among strangers brought together by chance. The atmosphere in the cabin has transformed dramatically since the flight began. What started as a tense confrontation between James and Karen has evolved into a profound dialogue involving most of the passengers. The air is charged with a mix of emotions, discomfort, understanding, and a shared sense of revelation. James turns to Karen, his expression softened. You know, when I first asked to switch seats, I never imagined we'd end up here. Karen nods, her earlier hostility replaced by a look of genuine reflection. I owe you an apology, James. My behavior was inexcusable. I've never been forced to confront my prejudices like this before. Admitting our faults is the first step towards change, James responds. We all have our biases and blind spots. The important thing is recognizing them and working to overcome them. Karen takes a deep breath. You're right. I need to do better. Not just here, but in my everyday life. I've been so focused on my career, on success, that I've ignored the bigger picture. A middle-aged man seated nearby leans in. I think many of us are guilty of that. It's easy to get caught up in our own worlds and forget about the struggles others face. James nods in agreement. That's true, but it's never too late to start seeing things differently, to start treating people with more empathy and understanding. Karen looks around the cabin, making eye contact with several passengers who have shared their stories. I want to thank everyone here. Your openness, your willingness to share your experiences, it's been eye-opening. A young woman speaks up. This conversation has made me realize how important it is to have these discussions, even when they're uncomfortable, especially when they're uncomfortable. James smiles. That's exactly right. Change doesn't happen in our comfort zones. It happens when we're challenged, when we're forced to confront difficult truths. As the conversation continues, there's a palpable sense of connection among the passengers. Strangers just hours ago, they now share a bond forged through honest dialogue and shared vulnerability. Karen turns back to James. I know a single conversation doesn't erase years of ingrained beliefs, but I promise you, I'm going to work on this. I'm going to do better. James extends his hand to Karen. That's all any of us can do. Keep learning, keep growing, and strive to be better than we were yesterday. As they shake hands, the other passengers applaud softly, acknowledging the transformative journey they've all undertaken on this flight. As the flight progresses, the conversation deepens, with passengers exploring how racism affects their lives in various ways. The cabin has become a safe space for honest dialogue, with people from diverse backgrounds sharing their experiences. A Black woman in her 30s speaks up. It's not just about obvious discrimination. It's the small things too, the microaggressions, the assumptions people make. It's exhausting having to constantly prove yourself. Her words resonate with several other passengers of color, who nod in agreement. A Latino man adds, "I've been asked where I'm really from more times than I can count, even though I was born here." It makes you feel like you don't belong. These personal stories spark a discussion about the subtle ways racism manifests in everyday life. White passengers listen intently, many admitting they've never considered these perspectives before. An Asian American teenager, encouraged by the open atmosphere, shares her experience. "In school, people always assume I'm good at math just because I'm Asian. It might seem like a positive stereotype, but it's still limiting and frustrating." Karen, who has been listening attentively, speaks up. "I'm realizing how many assumptions I've made without even thinking about it. It's uncomfortable to confront, but necessary." A middle-aged white man who initially seemed skeptical of the conversation joins in. "I always thought I wasn't part of the problem because I don't actively discriminate. But I'm starting to see that's not enough. We need to actively work against racism." This prompts a discussion about allyship and what it truly means to be anti-racist. Passengers share ideas on how to challenge racism in their workplaces, communities, and personal lives. James contributes, "In the military, we learned that unity is strength. But that unity doesn't mean ignoring our differences. It means respecting and valuing them." As the conversation continues, it's clear that this flight has become more than just a journey from one city to another. It's a journey of understanding, challenging long-held beliefs, and fostering connections across racial and social divides. The flight attendants, who have been quietly supportive of the discussion, begin preparing for the final descent into Los Angeles. There's a sense among the passengers that this conversation, while coming to an end, is just the beginning of a longer journey towards understanding and change. As the plane begins its descent into Los Angeles, there's a palpable sense of transformation among the passengers. The captain's announcement about their imminent arrival serves as a reminder that their journey, both physical and metaphorical, is coming to an end. James looks around the cabin, a mix of emotions on his face. When I boarded this flight, I never imagined it would turn out like this. I think we've all learned something today." Karen nods in agreement. "It's been eye-opening. I feel like I'm seeing the world differently now." She pauses, then adds, "But I also know this is just the beginning. We can't let this conversation end here." A middle-aged woman across the aisle speaks up. "You're right. We need to take what we've learned and apply it in our daily lives. But how do we ensure we don't forget once we step off this plane?" This prompts a discussion about concrete steps they can take to continue their growth and fight against racism. Passengers begin sharing ideas and making personal commitments. One passenger, a high school teacher, suggests, "What if we all write down one commitment we're making to combat racism and share it with the group? It could help hold us accountable." The idea is met with enthusiasm. Flight attendants quickly distribute small cards and pens to those who want to participate. For the next few minutes, the cabin is filled with the sound of pens scratching on paper as passengers thoughtfully consider their pledges. James and Karen exchange contact information, both expressing a desire to continue their dialogue beyond this flight. Other passengers follow suit, forming impromptu support networks. As the plane touches down, passengers begin sharing their commitments out loud. The promises range from educating themselves more about racial issues to actively speaking out against discrimination in their workplaces and communities. Karen reads her commitment. "I pledge to examine my own biases and actively work to overcome them. I will use my position in my company to promote diversity and inclusion." James shares his, "I commit to sharing my experiences more openly and working within my community to bridge racial divides." As passengers prepare to disembark, there's a sense of both accomplishment and responsibility. They've had a profound experience together, but the real work begins as they step off the plane and back into their everyday lives. The captain's voice comes over the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. I hope you've had a pleasant flight. And remember, the journey towards understanding and equality continues long after you leave this aircraft." As the passengers begin to disembark, the atmosphere is charged with a mix of emotions, reflection, determination, and a newfound sense of connection. The usual rush to exit is replaced by a slower, more deliberate movement as people exchange final words and contact information. Karen, now standing in the aisle, turns to James. I can't thank you enough for challenging me today. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Her voice carries a hint of emotion as she continues. I promise you, I'm going to work on myself and use my influence to make positive changes. James nods, a small smile on his face. That's all any of us can do. Keep learning, keep growing. This conversation was just the beginning. As they moved towards the exit, other passengers approached them, expressing gratitude for sparking such a meaningful dialogue. A young woman tells Karen, "Your willingness to admit your mistakes and commit to change, it's inspiring. It shows that it's never too late to start doing better." The middle-aged man who had been skeptical at the start of the flight approaches James. "I want to thank you for your service, not just to our country, but for what you did here today. You've opened a lot of eyes, including mine." As they step off the plane, the bright California sun greets them. The terminal bustles with activity, a stark contrast to the intimate atmosphere they've just left. Yet, there's a hesitancy among the group to disperse, to break the bond they've formed. Karen, her business demeanor softened, says to the group, "I know we all have places to be, but I feel like we can't just walk away from this. Does anyone want to grab a coffee and continue our discussion?" Several passengers nod in agreement. James adds, "I think that's a great idea. We've started something important here, and I'd hate to see it end at the gate." As they make plans to meet, a flight attendant approaches the group. "I just wanted to say, in all my years of flying, I've never seen passengers come together like this. You've given me hope for a better future." The group begins to move towards the baggage claim, their conversation continuing. They discuss plans to stay in touch, to share resources, and to support each other in their commitments to combat racism and promote understanding. As they walk, James reflects aloud. "You know, when I put on this uniform, I never imagined that one of my most important missions would happen on a commercial flight." Karen, walking beside him, responds, "And I never thought a business trip would turn into such a life-changing experience. I guess sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we don't expect." The group moves forward, not just towards the baggage claim, but towards a future they're now committed to shaping together. As the group of passengers moves through the terminal, their conversation continues, buzzing with plans and ideas for maintaining their newfound connections. However, the atmosphere shifts abruptly when a man approaches Karen, his face etched with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Karen Thompson? I thought that was you," he says, his voice tense. "Do you remember me? Mark Davis. I used to work for you." Karen's expression changes from surprise to unease. "Mark, yes, of course. It's been a while." Mark's eyes narrow. "And well, since you fired me, you mean? For not fitting into the company culture." We both know what that really meant. The other passengers, including James, watch the exchange with growing concern. James steps forward. "Sir, is everything all right?" Mark turns to James, his voice bitter. "Oh, it's far from all right. Did Karen here tell you about how she systematically pushed out employees of color from her company? How she denied promotions, created hostile work environments?" Karen pales, her earlier confidence crumbling. "Mark, that's not what happened. We had to make cuts, and dash." "Save it," Mark interrupts. He turns to the group. "Whatever come by a moment you all had on that plane, it's built on lies. People like Karen don't change." The revelation sends shockwaves through the group. Passengers exchange uncomfortable glances, the unity they felt moments ago threatening to fracture. James, struggling to process this new information, asks, "Karen, is this true?" Before Karen can respond, Mark adds a final, devastating piece of information. "You know what the real kicker is? My brother, who died serving our country, he was in the same unit as your friend here." He nods towards James. Small world, isn't it? The silence that follows is deafening. James stares at Karen, a mix of emotions playing across his face: disappointment, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. Karen, her voice barely above a whisper, says, I didn't know about your brother, about any of this. I made decisions based on what I thought was best for the company, but I see now. I was wrong. So wrong." The other passengers watch as the situation unfolds, the earlier optimism replaced by a harsh reality check. The complexities of systemic racism and personal responsibility are laid bare before them. James, after a moment of reflection, speaks up. This is exactly why the conversation we started on that plane is so important. It's not just about feeling good or making promises. It's about confronting ugly truths and taking real action to make changes. He turns to Karen, his expression stern but not unkind. Karen, you have a lot to answer for. But the real test of your commitment starts now. How will you make this right? The group stands at a crossroads, the euphoria of their earlier breakthroughs tempered by the reality of deeply ingrained systemic issues. As they face this new challenge, the true journey towards understanding and change is only just beginning.